So I'd like to welcome you all here and thank you for coming out, especially it's Mutual Appreciation Day, I think. So thank the 1816 Quaker Meeting House, the Waterloo Library and Historical Society, and of course the National Park Service for making sure all this came together. My name is Steve Tyler. I'm not going to sing to you, if you make that connection at all. And I'm a historian by training, if not career, but through a lot of life's twists and turns, I'm from Rochester, very interested in local history originally. Worked for the Park Service many years ago at a whole bunch of really exciting parks, very interesting parks, and then left that for a totally different career. And being retired, I've returned to kind of my roots, the National Park Service and local history, because the National Park Service doesn't just preserve the nation's history, it also helps preserve those local treasures. They do that partially through a park that is set in a small area and does that, but also through the national landmarks that are registered through the National Park Service and the legal protections that still exist on those. So that makes it, gives you the ability, especially people that are visiting from far away, to get to see that story of America in each of the little communities that you get to go to. So we're going to talk a little bit about a lot of details that maybe you don't know. So I'm going to introduce you to some ideas and some things during this talk. If you get confused, you can raise a hand. I don't have a problem taking questions throughout it. Some of the resources, better resources, are here with us from Farmington Quaker Meeting House. Please, at the end of this, stop, take some information from them on what they do. Bring it home with you, because all information, all knowledge builds up with time, and definitely have some of the snacks that they brought. And then Ranger Nicole will take everybody over to the house to see the place I'm talking about. The house across the street was the scene on July 16th, 1848, the drafting of the Declaration of Sentiments for the Women's Rights Convention that was held a little bit later that month in Seneca Falls. That document boldly called for equal education for women, equal opportunities in careers, equal justice for women, and their first point in the Declaration, the vote. That alone would be reason enough to care for the work that the National Park Service went through to preserve the house, which it purchased in 1985. But I'm focusing on not just that piece of the story. The Declaration of Sentiments is only one branch of the tree. Who were the McClintocks, though, that lived in that house, that they became hosts for the convention planning? What other parts did they play? I would say that without the McClintocks living right here across the street, there would have been no convention in Seneca Falls. I believe they were the catalyst to the first convention on women's rights being held here in the Finger Lakes, and maybe you'll start to see them in that light as well, if I can get the technology to work. Thomas McClintock was born in late March 1792 in Brandywine Hundred, Delaware. That's that curve that's just north of Wilmington, between Wilmington and Philadelphia. Thomas was 13 when his father died, and we kind of lose track of him in the historical record. Probably he was sent around that time by his older brother, who inherited most of the property and started taking care of his mother and the rest of the family, to Philadelphia to learn a trade. We know in July 1811, in Philadelphia, he asked to be accepted into the Society of Friends. He joined by proclamation, proclaiming his beliefs in Quaker faith. His mother had been a Quaker, but Thomas's father was actually a member of the Presbyterian Church. The influence that his mother gave him was something that was very deep within him. We have no record which meeting house he attended, but he joined the Southern District, which met at Pine Street. He was 19 years old when he proclaimed his membership, and we know by age 23 he had established an apothecary, probably what he was being trained to do as a youth, and a residence on South 9th Street. That's the same block as the University of Pennsylvania's surgical theater at that time, and it meant that he was a very successful businessman. He had business all the time, 7 days a week, in fact. He probably worshiped about a third of a mile away at 12th Street Meeting House rather than a mile away at Pine Street, where the monthly meeting was held. Two events impact our story that occurred around 1820. First is that Thomas's brother Samuel died. His wife having previously died as well, that left his children as orphans. So Thomas brought into his house his young niece, Sarah McClintock, and his younger nephew, Thomas. Sarah was 19 at the time, and Thomas was 13. He also met and married his wife around the same time. His wife, Mary Ann Wilson, is vitally important to this story as well. Mary Ann Wilson is 8 years younger, born in 1800 in Philadelphia, to a Quaker family, which means she was a birthright Quaker. Her parents were members of the Society of Friends, and Mary Ann's father married her mother as his second wife, bringing a 7-year-old daughter, 7 years older sister, Margaret, into the family. How Thomas and Mary Ann met, we don't know. There's a lot of documentation, and as a historian, you're supposed to follow the documentation, not guess too much. And we don't know how long their courtship was, but we do know they married in Burlington, New Jersey, at Mary Ann's meeting in 1820 on a Thursday with 60 people present. Thomas at that point was 28 years old, Mary Ann was 20, and he brought her to Philadelphia, and they started a family. Thomas's business appears to have thrived, and his and Mary Ann's household grew in center Philadelphia with the addition of 2 daughters. Elizabeth, or Lizzie, was born in May of 1821, and Mary Ann, or Molly, to prevent confusion, was born in October the year later. Mary Ann's widowed mother also moved in with them. So you see this household is growing pretty big in 1822. While having niece Sarah and mother Elizabeth certainly helped, there was probably hardly enough space for anybody to move. So far it sounds like we have a typical Quaker family in a typical Quaker city in the new 50-year-old republic. Everybody is finding their way. Everything is good. Business is very good. While having niece Sarah and mother Elizabeth there certainly helped domestically, it didn't necessarily make things very easy for Mary Ann. As the fortune cookie says, may you live in interesting times. And the McClintocks weren't just involved in trying to keep their household from bumping into each other. They were also involved in some of the major controversies and were involved in the movements in American society, religion, and politics. We're going to get into some weeds here, but to know the McClintocks as Quakers or friends is to understand the McClintocks and why they continually took on what they did and how that impacts us today. So I'm going to skip ahead. The Quaker beliefs and practices I'm going to talk about are historical. While there's carryover into modern-day Quakerism, I'm not a Quaker. I don't pretend to understand enough to speak about or for friends today. There are other people and resources for that. But Quakers in the first half of the 19th century are a complicated enough subject to wrestle with. The Society of Friends, or Quakers, formed from people dissatisfied with established and dissenting churches in England in the 1650s and united under the common belief that their God provided an inner light that would guide anyone who would seek it to a better understanding of God. That's an oversimplification, but the light within was a Quaker distinction. Originally, Quakers had little structure, but to prevent adhering people to their meetings, who they would call ranters, they began to develop a discipline and created an order of meetings where they would discuss business and polity on a regular schedule. Quakers began coming to America in the 1600s, soon after forming, both fleeing persecution in Britain and to share their beliefs and way of worship. Pennsylvania, chartered to Quaker William Penn, became a center for their religion, but they were present in increasing numbers everywhere but Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut, where they faced persecution from Puritan leaders. Quakers were close-knit in community, close-knit in kinship, because of a rule about marrying outside of the society. And for the most part, they prospered because they were known for their peacefulness and their honesty in business dealings and with their neighbors and with each other. They kept close watch on each other, expelling members who didn't live up to the meeting standards. It was a participative faith, and Thomas, who had joined by profession, and Mary Ann, took active roles in it. Philadelphia was the center of Quakerism in America, and there were many meeting houses in the city. And while I haven't run across documentation, the McClintocks attended 12th Street meeting, which fell under Southern District Monthly meeting, which they had both joined. It was only a few blocks away from where their apothecary in residence was. Pine Street was a mile away. So it's probably not coincidental to our story that James Mott and his wife, Lucretia, who knew the McClintocks well, also attended 12th Street meeting. Lucretia Mott, in 1822, sent a letter to her husband, James's grandfather, on Long Island, and mentions mentions our friend Thomas McClintock in connection with a Quaker minister named Elias Hicks. I'm kind of getting in the weeds here, so follow along. Hicks was also from Long Island, and some things Thomas and Hicks had in common, or had written in common about Sabbath day practices, had been shared with Lucretia Mott by her grandfather-in-law. Sabbath day practices sounds like an odd subject to modern ears, but it was among the several sore topics for Quakers at that time. And it happens that by 1820, Elias Hicks was a lightning rod for controversy, especially in Philadelphia. Thomas, along with the Motts, were squarely on Hicks's side in many of these debates, which were really quarrels within the Quaker community. By 1820, the question of what Hicks was saying as he traveled to different meetings from his home meeting on Long Island, became an ongoing controversy and created two groups of Quakers: those who suspected him of spreading false testimony, and those who supported his denials of that accusation and his right as a minister from a different yearly meeting, New York yearly meeting, to attend meetings under Philadelphia yearly meeting and to speak at those meetings. Underlying this conflict was a question of who gets to decide what Quakers believe. In the Quaker understanding, all people, all individuals have that inward light, and what was happening and how it was happening wasn't respectful to that. Maybe listening in quiet reflection to the light was missing. Maybe the individual conscience was being drowned out as the ministers and elders who sat in the high benches at the front of the meeting, people self-selected by the ministers and elders and not chosen in the meetings or the general membership, were telling them what and from whom they could hear, say, or do. These issues were exacerbated by the growing strength and influence of evangelicalism in America and by contact with Quakerism in the 1800s. An additional issue raised by Hicks was his stance on the evils of slavery. While American Quakers had, by the Revolution, made holding enslaved persons an action that would lead to disownment and membership in the Society of Friends, in the first quarter of the 19th century, there were still questions among Quakers about how much business connected to slavery a Quaker could do that wouldn't be unscrupulous or even sinful, because separating from anything made by slaves or anything touched by slavery was very difficult. Hicks said absolutely not. You could not have contact in good conscience with anything produced by slave labor. And while some Quakers tried to avoid touching slavery rewarding goods, they often found it very hard. Pennsylvania itself had enacted a gradual abolition act in 1780 because it was still under the influence of the Quakers, so that by the 1820 census there remained only 211 enslaved persons in the state, officially. But Philadelphia is a border city. It borders with the slave states of Delaware and Maryland. So even if free and constant contact with slavery, formerly enslaved people, and enslaved people being brought by visitors from slave states, and especially people fleeing it, all that made the issue ever present in Philadelphia and among the Quakers. Quakers were divided on this issue, with some meetings presenting to the yearly meetings proposal for absence of contact with slavery-produced goods proposed as a rule, and others saying it was just not the right time. It was too hard to do such a thing, too big a burden to place on the other meetings. So at yearly meetings, they were deciding not to do that. And eventually it became one of the conflicts over what Hicks was saying as he traveled around. We left the McClintock household having no space. In 1825, the McClintock family and the apothecary business relocated north to 5th Street and Callow Hill Street in the Northern Liberties District, just north of the city proper. It was a thriving and wealthy suburb with an influx of people, mostly Quakers, moving there from the middle of the city and into larger homes. The McClintocks rented space in a commercial area, again placing the family just 1/3 of a mile walk to the nearest meeting house, which was now Green Street. Another daughter, Julia, was added to the family probably in 1826, although there's no record of her date of birth, although there is in some places, so I wasn't sure which number to use. Green Street meeting was part of the Northern District monthly meeting, and moving there placed the McClintocks in a meeting, the only meeting house in Philadelphia that was supportive of Hicks and thick in the middle of the struggle over accepted Quaker beliefs. Here, Thomas and Mary Ann took major roles in the ever-increasing battle for control in the various meetings leading up to each yearly meeting. Quakers held a lot of meetings. Meeting houses in the city, as I noted, were dominated by the anti-Hicksite Quakers, who, while those outside the city and more rural districts favored Hicks and his supporters, neither side could stop the other's arguments over who was in the right. The year 1827 started with the establishment for the McClintocks of the Free Produce Society of Pennsylvania. Most of the names in the list of members who refused to sell or trade in products that were associated with slave labor were also co-laborers in the struggle over Elias Hicks's preaching. James Mott features in this group, being named secretary. There were sacrifices. James dealt in cotton, but Lucretia had demanded her household would not have anything tainted by slavery. And by 1830, James had transitioned to the wool trade. The McClintocks may have had less difficulty in obtaining free products used for medicines, but free household goods were often not of the same quality as those touched by enslaved labor. Less success for the McClintocks was at the Philadelphia yearly meeting, where the fight for control came to its head in 1827, when the anti-Hicks group was able to re-elect their candidate for clerk of the meeting, and control of the meeting. The person who decided what decision was made and recorded them in the minutes. The separation of the Quakers in Philadelphia into the remaining Orthodox branch and separated Hicksite branch started then and sent reverberations and schism throughout the country into other local monthly, quarterly, and yearly meetings. Families were occasionally torn apart by the decision. At the end of August, the family requested removal from membership in the Orthodox Northern District monthly meeting and transfer specifically to the now Hicksite Green Street meeting, which was part of the rural Abington Quarterly meeting, which followed Hicks. I've talked a lot about Thomas McClintock, but I haven't really mentioned Mary Ann. While Thomas juggled a busy apothecary, his work, thank you. While Thomas juggled a busy apothecary, his work in the Society of Friends, and apparently his depth of reading, Mary Ann had the babies and kept the house. And this sounds so anticlimactic in the story, that Mary was just like a second-class person. But that's not quite true. Quaker women filled a domestic sphere that was similar to where other women were placed. But similar is not really how Mary Ann was, and neither were other Quaker women. They had learned through their meeting that they had voices, that they had agency, and that they could take part in decisions. And as we look at Mary Ann through the 1830s, we see this. A son was added in 1829, Charles Wilson, or Charlie McClintock. And tragedy struck the family sometime between late 1827 and 1831 with the death of Julia. Again, we have no record of when she died, but the loss was one that Mary Ann never got over, commenting 25 years later in 1856 that the premature death of her darling child was caused by ignorance of the laws of God which govern our physical being. In 1831, a new daughter was born. They would name her Julia after their lost child. Two years later, we find Mary Ann finally actively participating in her community. Not that she wasn't before, but now she had time for committees and meetings. In December 1833, William Lloyd Garrison held a small convention to form an abolitionist society in Philadelphia. Many of the white people, males, Quakers included, who were trying to free enslaved people, were not supportive of free black people remaining in the United States, at least in large numbers, and supported an organization called the American Colonization Society. But colonization was universally, almost universally, opposed by black people, who felt that they belonged in this country, the country they were born in and had helped build. Garrison believed this also, and in addition called for immediate abolition of slavery and freedom and equal rights for the formerly enslaved. The McClintocks and Motts, as well as other Quakers, supported this position as well. Thomas McClintock was not sent as one of the 60 or so delegates to that founding meeting in 1833 of the American Anti-Slavery Society, but his friend James Mott was. And Lucretia Mott actually spoke before the men at one of the meetings that was held. Lucretia and Mary Ann would, a few days later, form the integrated Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. It had to be the Female Anti-Slavery Society because you can't have men and women meeting together in 1833. But the women refused to exclude, because of their color, black women. Mary Ann was also invited on women's committees in Green Street meeting. In 1834, she became a member of a committee of women tasked with making changes to the discipline. And this is an important part of the story. The discipline governed members, and we see how different Quaker women saw their roles both in meeting and in society. One of the nagging problems within the Society of Friends was that even though they proclaimed that there was no distinction between men and women in their God's eyes, they continued the social distinctions which rested authority in men. Quakers would meet for quiet, usually quiet, worship together, listening for that inner light. But women sat on one side of the meeting house and men on the other. There was a practical reason for this, because following worship, they would divide into business meetings, with the men's meeting on one side of the open space and women's on the other. Dividers could be added or removed, physically designed and built into Quaker meeting houses to create separate spaces and enable discussions by women or men which would not interfere with the work in the other meeting. Equal, yet not. What often occurred was that the men's meeting would make decisions without seeking out the women's meeting for either co-approval or even suggestion. Thomas had seen and commented on the injustice of this, and Mary Ann surely felt it more sharply than Thomas. The 8-member Women's Committee at Green Street, of which Mary Ann was a part, set out to end this and unanimously recommended in 1835 the women's meeting be given the power to decide women's memberships or disciplinary actions, and in taking care of Quaker women in need to have access to resources that the men's meetings had, to have equal say in granting ministers their approval, and that when future changes to the discipline were going to be considered, that men and women would meet in a joint committee. In 1835, this was new. This was major change. It was so big that when the women's meeting looked at the committee's proposals, they declined to forward them to the men's meeting. The statement in the women's meeting minutes bears hearing. We believe fervent desires have been raised, and in this deeply interesting subject, we dwell deep under the influence of divine love, keeping in view that it is only steady attention that a progression keeping in truth is known and strength gained to move forward at a right time under its holy influence. For the Quakers at Green Street meeting, giving power to the women, it was not the right time. There we go. As busy as they became following the great separation of Quakers in 1827, time in Philadelphia for the McClintocks was actually growing short. At the beginning of 1836, Thomas was recognized for his gift in the ministry with a minute or letter of intent from Green Street meeting, allowing him to travel to other meeting houses and hold or speak at meetings there. In April, he received permission from Green Street to visit the meeting houses under New York Yearly Meeting as well as Genesee Yearly Meeting, which met at Farmington each summer. In September 1836, they requested to leave Green Street meeting to join Junius Monthly Meeting here in Waterloo on 9-Foot Road, just north of Route 96. That fall, leaving by ship for New York, the McClintocks moved their household by water from Philadelphia along the coast, up the Hudson, and then down the 11-years-old Erie Canal and slightly older Cayuga-Seneca Canal to Waterloo. Why did the McClintocks leave Philadelphia in 1836, a place they had always been near, to come to Waterloo? For one thing, Mary Ann's mother died late in 1835, making a change in location less of a physical risk to some in the household. The youngest, Julia, was 5 years old at this time, Julia II. There was opportunity here for an experienced apothecary and business person. There were relatives nearby. Mary Ann's older half-sister, Margaret Wilson, and her husband, George Pryor, lived here in the Finger Lakes region, as well as a number of other Quaker communities in this area. Waterloo is on a canal, and it was centrally located a short distance from the bustling Erie Canal cities of Rochester and Syracuse, and the smaller but substantial communities of Geneva, Canandaigua, and Auburn. Thomas had made calls here as a minister, seeing it firsthand. Now, historians tend to rely on written documentation. So I'm going to go into speculative territory here because no written evidence exists on what I'm wondering. But I would not be surprised if Richard Pell Hunt invited Thomas to bring his family to Waterloo. The house on William Street, that's right outside here, which we will go see, was no more than a year old, if that. The date of construction isn't documented, but the McClintocks were the first people we know that moved into it. It would be pure speculation that it was built for the McClintocks. but perhaps it was. The new apothecary was initially set up in the former S. Lundy and Sons store on north side of West Main Street, west of Virginia Street. Thomas purchased the store and the goods, and by December, advertisements were showing it was fully stocked. It was also free of products tainted by enslaved labor. He would maintain that business as a free produce business for the entirety that he ran it. Thomas had also been busy on the canal trip, and after his business was established, edited and published a book of the letters from a back and forth correspondence in a newspaper in Delaware on Quaker beliefs. Thomas also started jumping into organizing anti-slavery talks and meetings in his business on Main Street in Waterloo. This wasn't a popular stance with everybody in Waterloo, and throughout the McClintock stay here, they would be warned of opposition to this work. At one point, an offending effigy was hung from the McClintock store sign. This did not stop them. In the fall of 1837, 1 year after they arrived in Waterloo, niece Sarah, 30, married Richard Hunt, 40. Hunt's previous wife, his second, who died after only a few months of marriage, led him to a period of questioning his future, whether he wanted to continue living here in Waterloo or move. His wife was a Quaker from Westchester County, and Hunt's family had also been Quakers from there, although they had been removed from membership for now unknown reasons. But Hunt had carried with him his Quakerism, and after his second wife looked to make good the faith he was raised in. It may be that Richard knew and began courting Sarah while in Philadelphia before the McClintocks even moved to Waterloo. Certainly, though, he was much attached to the McClintocks before their move. The fact that Hunt made the house on William Street available, as well as his support of the McClintocks' anti-slavery work, and opening his home on the east side of the village as a station on the Underground Railroad, attest to this. Richard Hunt was always investing in Waterloo. He built a series of stores on East Main Street, and the first was built in 1839, right behind the house, and Thomas moved his apothecary and anti-slavery meetings from West Main Street to East Main Street, just a short walk out his back door. In 1838, the McClintocks had a scare and were reinforced in their desire to end the wickedness of slavery, as Thomas described it in a letter to a Philadelphia newspaper. A series of free produce and anti-slavery conventions were to be held on successive days in Philadelphia to dedicate the new Pennsylvania Hall. Whoops, there's Waterloo. I missed one. There we go. Pennsylvania Hall was built by anti-slavery money. Donations were made because there were no meeting houses willing, or churches willing to accept anti-slavery conventions in Philadelphia. It was a troubling topic. 17-year-old Elizabeth McClintock was sent to Philadelphia to represent her family at the new meetings, the opening meetings in Pennsylvania Hall, and visit with her family. It was an experience she would never forget. The topics and speeches thrilled Elizabeth, and the fact that the speakers were still speaking despite the tumult outside really made an impression. For the people of Philadelphia were in no mood to allow such an open outrage on their sensibilities in their very city. Ugly crowds gathered around the building each day and evening, shouting and throwing rocks at the windows. Black men and black women were commingling with white women and white men inside the building. On the third night of the series, after the attendees bravely left arm in arm, a mob entered the building and burned it to the ground. Lucretia Mott described how gangs roamed neighborhoods afterwards, looking for where the speakers had gone, and only through neighbors misdirecting them did their own house not get attacked. The McClintocks were frantic when they found out what had happened in Philadelphia, frantic over what had happened and frantic for Elizabeth's safety. Relief brought outrage and sadness that the people of their former home could exhibit such meanness and anger. But this only reinforced their desire to end slavery. In 1840, Richard Hunt wove and dyed green cloth as a gift for William Lloyd Garrison, head of the American Anti-Slavery Society and publisher of The Liberator. It was to make a new suit for him to wear at the first World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Richard Hunt also served as a delegate to the American Anti-Slavery Society Convention in New York, held prior to the London one. The convention expanded on the existing controversy that had taken place in 1839 over the role of women in the American Anti-Slavery Society. That caused a split within the movement the year before. Garrison was for women taking an equal role in his organization. Other leaders were not, and they left, warning Garrison that this would cause problems if women were made equal and given a voice. The London organizers sent letters warning Garrison not to send women delegates. Garrison, on the eve of the convention, wrote to Thomas, wishing he could join as a delegate of the American Anti-Slavery Society in London. But in the end, the women who did attend there had no more voice than Thomas. They were not recognized, and they were not seated as delegates. But it was an important convention to have. At this convention, seated together, were Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they discussed the injustice of this. And sitting right beside them was a young cousin of the McClintocks, Elizabeth Neal, who would later stay the better part of the year in that house across the street on Williams Street. Even though they didn't travel to London through the 1840s, the McClintocks were busy in both religious and anti-slavery work, as well as the regular business. Thomas would travel as a minister, and Lucretia Mott commented in a letter that he held meetings in Philadelphia in 1844. Sometimes these activities brought the family into a circle of people that are more often associated with them later in the decade. In January of 1841, Thomas organized a day of discussion on the true Sabbath, that old topic, in Port Byron, with a Congregationalist, the abolitionist Henry Brewster of Leroy, New York. Henry Brewster was the uncle of Henry B. for Brewster Stanton, the husband in 1840 of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. It was Brewster who took in his sister, Henry Stanton's mother, and Henry's siblings when they left Connecticut after his mother's divorce from Henry's father. Another connection little discussed is the person the family relied on to cure their ills, along with Thomas's preparations, of course. In nearby Seneca Falls, a young lawyer was suddenly changing careers and began studying and practicing homeopathy rather than law. Edward Bayard treated the McClintock family regularly through the 1840s, even prescribing care for Mary Ann in the winter of 1848 after the Bayards had moved to New York City. Edward's wife, Tryphena Cady Bayard, was the elder sister of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. We know that Elizabeth visited the Bayards in Seneca Falls in the autumn of 1841, and there's little doubt that through them she got to know the McClintocks. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, writing to their cousin Elizabeth Neal to pass along greetings to the McClintocks in 1843. The McClintocks opened the doors of their house to any guests, possibly making it or the store a station on the Underground Railroad. By 1841, there was a railroad station here in Waterloo, just about a block away here, allowing more rapid travel, arriving in about 4 hours to Rochester. Or they could travel to Syracuse and beyond west or east more quickly than by stagecoach. William Lloyd Garrison came to stay here in 1842 and again in 1847, meeting with other abolitionists in the area while pausing in Waterloo. The house became a noted haven for abolitionist speakers, along with Margaret and George Pryor's home during periods when they were living in Waterloo. Abby Kelly, whose daughter Elizabeth had met in Philadelphia, and her acerbic husband, Stephen S. Foster, were visitors at both homes. Other abolitionist speakers as well, Frederick Douglass and Charles Remond, stayed with the McClintocks during their 1847 speaking tour. It was noted by somebody close to the McClintocks that there was seldom an empty bed or spare seat at the table in their house. Work for anti-slavery became a family effort. In November 1842, Mary Ann and Thomas are found attending an anti-slavery convention in Rochester, where Thomas is placed on the executive board and Mary Ann is assigned to committees that help organize the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society. A week later, we find Elizabeth on a business committee organizing the anti-slavery convention in Syracuse with William Lloyd Garrison. Thomas was named to the executive board at that meeting. And their work continued into the next year with a fair to raise money in Rochester for the cause that was attended by Thomas, Elizabeth, and the Pryors. Thomas now has the duty of manager or organizers of local meetings of the AASS in Western New York, and he served as an agent throughout the 1840s for the newspaper The Liberator. In 1854, he was selected as a vice president of the American Anti-Slavery Society. I'm going to jump ahead to the 1850s briefly and talk about an incident in the William Street house. And it's related to their steadfast work, the McClintock steadfast work in slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 set a shock through the free states. No longer could freedom seekers take for granted their safety from slave catchers. The new law punished anyone who did not cooperate in apprehending an escaped enslaved person and ordered federal officials to aid slave catchers in taking legally or otherwise enslaved persons into custody. On October 1st, 1851, a black man, William Henry, but known locally as Jerry, was taken into custody by federal marshals in Syracuse. October 1st was also the day the Liberty Party was holding an anti-slavery convention in Syracuse, and things suddenly went bad for the marshals, and good for Jerry, as people throughout Syracuse broke him out of custody, hid him, and got him off to Canada. With Jerry gone, officials started to arrest the Syracuse abolition leaders who had assisted with his freedom. Jermaine Loguen was a minister in the AME Zion Church in Syracuse, and having escaped from enslavement himself, was open about using his house and resources as part of the Underground Railroad. He was considered a ringleader in the Jerry rescue and accused of assaulting a marshal to aid in his rescue, something he denied, only admitting to helping plan it. The question was, if he was arrested, would he be brought to trial, allowed to present a defense, or would he immediately be turned over to his enslaver? Would justice be done, or would he face enslavement and likely death? Everyone saw only the latter result, especially Loguen, and he set off for Canada, following a route he had set other freedom seekers along. And that's how he ended up in the McClintock house in Waterloo, a stop for people seeking freedom from enslavement and a new life. Thomas Mumford, a young man in Waterloo at the time, but later a Unitarian minister, was in the home while Loguen was in hiding there. Years later, he recalled Loguen was a large man, well armed, and spent the night pacing his room. One can only imagine what the Quakers in the house thought of the danger, but they were willing to risk their safety for the freedom of another, something they probably did in countless other instances. Having joined Junius Meeting in 1836, and I didn't give credit to this photo, this is from Swarthmore College, Friends Historical Library. Having joined Junius Meeting in 1836, Thomas and Mary Ann set out to be a part of that meeting and of Genesee Yearly Meeting. Genesee Yearly Meeting had been created from New York Yearly Meeting only a few years earlier to better serve the westward expansion of Quaker membership. It extended from the Finger Lakes westward through to Michigan and also into Ontario, what was then Upper Canada. Thomas served as clerk of the yearly meetings for a time, retaining his message or letter as minister. One of the first things the McClintocks brought to Junius was the reforms to the discipline that Mary Ann had suggested back in Philadelphia. Place the men and women's meetings in equality in the yearly meeting. It made its way from Junius to the yearly meeting held in Farmington, and it, in Quaker parlance, being the right time, was accepted in 1837. Anti-slavery work in the organized movement, though, caused issues. While the McClintocks and other Quakers felt a moral obligation to do everything they could, other Quakers believed that some of the methods were against their historic testimony. Speakers in the American Anti-Slavery Society were paid, but Quakers did not believe in paid ministers. If you were given the gift of ministry, you would go and it would be provided, things with money or shelter or food would be provided to you as you traveled. So no paid ministers were allowed to speak at a Quaker meeting, and no Quakers could go to a church service where ministers were paid to say words. Many Quakers looked at the two things as the same. Yet the Quakers who were part of the AASS wanted to allow paid anti-slavery speakers to use their meeting houses. Another question was a constant focus on abolition taking away other voices that needed to be heard during regular meetings? Was it God or humans charting what was the best way to end slavery? Quietism within the meeting house and in Quaker lives was part of listening to the inner light. Was it actually being listened to? It can't be overemphasized how much this was an issue. Some of the Quakers who held these concerns were the elders and ministers, and the problems that came from the concerns over Hicks's speaking came to Genesee Yearly Meeting with the abolitionists. In Michigan, the quarterly meeting in 1841 simply ended the meeting of ministers and elders. They decided that their own men's and women's meetings could make the decision and not have a select meeting make them for them. For 7 years, Genesee Yearly Meeting instructed Michigan's quarterly meeting to return the practice set forth in the discipline of a select meeting of ministers and elders. And for 7 years, Michigan Quarterly Meeting said no. We come to that anniversary of today. On Monday, June 12th and Tuesday, June 13th, 1848, discussion about what to do with Michigan Quarterly Meeting filled the meeting house in Farmington. It was hot in both temperature and, unfortunately, temperament. On Wednesday, June 14th, on the third day of meetings, the question was closed. The clerk of the meeting refused to recognize Michigan's representatives, and his station as clerk was upheld, as was the recognition that it would cause a separation like that of the one 21 years earlier in Philadelphia. The Motts and McClintocks were at both. On the first day of the meetings, Lucretia had presented, as one observer wrote, one of the best sermons he had ever listened to, but it did not calm spirits. Both the men's meeting and women's meetings at that yearly meeting had the same result. And 200 or so Quakers who disagreed with laying down Michigan's quarterly meeting left the meeting house in Farmington and gathered in an open field next to it and asked each other where to start now. The Motts still had their membership in Philadelphia, but the McClintocks and others were seeing that they were starting anew. They hadn't been expelled from membership, but this was an opportunity to see if Quakers really needed oversight from select members. Over the next 3 days, those 200 held their own meeting, and it's surmised that it was just one, men's and women's, meeting together, not separately. And together they planned their future, with many who could travel agreeing to meet in Junius in October and establishing the Congregational Friends. Lucretia and James Mott had come from Philadelphia to visit Genesee Yearly Meeting, as well as travel to the Cattaraugus-Seneca Reservation and into southern Ontario to visit Native Americans' communities of now free black men and women. They were based at Lucretia's sister Martha C. Wright's home in Auburn, but also stayed at the home of other Quakers during the yearly meeting, as Farmington is not particularly close to either Auburn or Waterloo by carriage. The McClintocks were so important to the Motts, and the question of what comes next for their friends in Western New York was so confusing that when an invitation to meet Mary Ann and her daughters at the Hunt's house to see Jane Hunt's new baby, Sarah McClintock Hunt having died in 1842, Lucretia and Martha set the day aside, July 9th, and took the train from Auburn, possibly stopping in Seneca Falls to gather up Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was also invited. It's hard to imagine that the falling out in Farmington was not discussed at length at that gathering, but it's remembered for something else, and I would posit that what happened on June 13th would be the trigger for what happened on July 19th and 20th. Women who had known each other for years decided that a door closing on one thing should make a door open wide somewhere else. They decided to hold a convention on women's rights in Seneca Falls before the Motts had to return to Philadelphia. After parting from the meeting at the Hunts, they kept in touch, but we only have snippets of the planning that they did. The two Elizabeths, Cady Stanton and McClintock, decided to hold a planning meeting on Sunday, July 16th at the McClintocks in Waterloo. Other than Mary Ann and the Elizabeths, we surmise that Sarah and Julia may have been there. I would not be surprised if Tommy and Charlie were involved as well, as Thomas was noted by an observer that he wasn't the head, but one of the equal heads of the family. We know the convention set off a movement that has continued to fight to place women on an equal footing with men in religion, society, work, and politics against all trials and oppositions. So I ask you, if not at the McClintock's house in Waterloo, then where in this country, than the house across the street, would so rich and fertile a place have been for such an idea to be planted? Thomas Mumford, in remembering this place, wrote, "Nowhere else could we find such fresh literature or such intelligent interest in vital questions of the day. Gradually our horizon enlarged, our prejudices were conquered, and our sympathies enlisted in behalf of righteousness and freedom. That house was our gateway into the wildest realms of thought and the richest fields of duty. The family were teachers to whom we owe the best part of our education, for they taught and exemplified, in a modest yet powerful way, entire disregard for all worldliness and mere conventionalism, and a scorn of popularity as a test of truth. At Thomas McClintock's, we first saw the writings of Dr. Channing and Theodore Parker. There we met Lucretia Mott, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Samuel J. May. Most of the men and women prominent in reform movements were sometimes found under that roof." The McClintocks would move from Waterloo in July 1856, returning to Philadelphia and eventually returning to Pennsylvania and eventually Philadelphia. Thomas would die there in 1876 and Mary Ann in 1844. The house they rented from Richard Hunt would continue to be known locally as the McClintock House. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1980 and purchased by the National Park Service in 1985, and since restored to present itself much as it did when all these things happened in it. Thank you.